My name is Claire, I am 29 years old, and on my wedding day 3 chairs in the front row sat empty. They were meant for my parents and my sister, but they never walked through the doors. A week earlier, they swore money was too tight, that even a 3-hour drive was impossible. I wanted to believe them, so I saved the seats anyway, tied with ribbons, holding on to hope. But later that night, one photo would rip that hope apart. It showed my entire family not struggling, not absent by chance, but dressed in gowns and tuxedos, raising champagne at a place I never could have imagined. That image shattered more than my wedding day. What it exposed nearly destroyed everything I thought I knew, and what came next proved betrayal always carries a price. Stay with me until the end, because the truth behind that photo will leave you breathless. And to understand that photo, you need to see where the day started. I could feel the air in the church shift the moment the organ began to play. Everyone stood, their heads turning toward me as the double doors opened. The sunlight from outside spilled in for a second, casting long shadows across the pews, and all eyes fell on me in my white dress. I gripped the bouquet tighter, steadying my breath, forcing myself to walk forward with the smile I had practiced 100 times in the mirror. My maid of honor, Lily, whispered softly behind me, steadying the train of my gown, and I nodded to her without looking back. As I stepped down the aisle, my eyes searched for the one thing I had wanted since I was a child. 3 seats reserved at the very front, marked with simple white ribbons, saved for my parents and my sister Rachel. The sight of them nearly stopped me in my tracks. They were empty. Not a jacket draped across the pew, not a handbag or scarf to suggest they had even thought about showing up. Just 3 untouched seats surrounded by the warm glow of candlelight and the quiet rustle of people turning in their seats to watch me. My chest tightened. For a moment, the noise of the church faded, and all I could hear was the echo of my own pulse. I forced my gaze away and found Jordan waiting at the altar, his eyes soft, steady, filled with love. He smiled at me in a way that made my knees weak, and I willed myself to keep moving, step after step, like nothing was wrong. Reverend Wilson guided us through the vows, his voice calm and practiced. The words felt heavy on my tongue as I repeated them, but Jordan's hands around mine anchored me. His fingers brushed my knuckles as if to say he already knew the storm raging inside me and he was there to shelter me. Guests sniffled quietly. Phones lifted for pictures, and I told myself again and again that I had to hold it together. This was my day, my marriage, my moment to finally feel chosen. The kiss sealed it. Applause filled the church and echoed through the high ceiling. For a fleeting second, I closed my eyes and let myself imagine my parents clapping too. Rachel grinning with tears on her face, all of them proud of me. When I opened them, the empty seats were still there, unmoved, unforgiving. The reception was held in the ballroom of a historic inn overlooking Newport Harbor. Crystal chandeliers glowed above us, glasses clinked, music drifted in waves as servers brought trays of hors d'oeuvres. Jordan's family filled the space with warmth, hugging me, calling me daughter, showering us both with love. I smiled, but inside there was a crack forming wider and wider with every toast. Lily stayed close to me, refilling my glass with water, fixing my veil when it slipped. She leaned in as the DJ announced it was time to cut the cake. I forced a laugh as Jordan guided my hand on the silver knife, our friends and his family cheering us on. The cake shimmered under the lights, 3 tiers of buttercream perfection, and the photographer moved in close, urging us to smile bigger. I felt the muscles in my cheeks straining. Then Lily's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her face shifting from joy to something else entirely. She hesitated before tapping me on the elbow. I turned, still holding the knife, frosting already smeared across Jordan's fingers. Lily whispered, her voice low so no one else could hear. "You need to see this." She slipped the phone into my hand. For a moment my brain did not register what I was looking at. It was a photo, bright and polished, posted just an hour ago. The caption read, "Formal night on the Queen Mary 2. So blessed." My eyes darted across the image. There was Rachel, her dark hair pinned elegantly draped in a sequined gown. Ethan stood beside her in a tuxedo, glass raised. And there unmistakably were my parents, Mom's pearls glinting under the ship's lights, Dad beaming in his navy blazer, all of them toasting together on the deck of the Grand Ocean liner. The music and laughter of the ballroom blurred into silence. My hands went cold. The phone shook slightly as I gripped it tighter, staring at the screen until the letters blurred. I could almost hear the ocean behind them, the clink of glasses, the soft laughter carried on salt air, while here I stood, surrounded by people who had shown up for me, yet pierced by the absence of the ones who should have been there. First, I forced a smile for the camera as Jordan fed me a bite of cake, sweet frosting sticking to my lips. The guests clapped oblivious while inside me something sharp splintered. I handed the phone back to Lily without a word and set down the fork, my stomach twisting too tight to swallow. The chandelier above shimmered with 1,000 points of light, but all I could see was the glow of that ship's deck, my family's glasses raised in celebration, not of me, but of themselves. And in that moment, surrounded by laughter, I realized just how alone I truly was. A week before the wedding, I had picked up the phone and dialed my mother's number, heart racing a little as it always did when I reached out. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp but controlled, as though she already knew why I was calling. I told her the date once again, reminded her of the time and placed the reservations, the hotel nearby. For a moment she was quiet, and I thought she might soften. Instead, she sighed heavily and began listing reasons like stones placed one by one on my chest. Gas was too expensive, property taxes had just gone up. My father's back was acting up again, and Rachel and Ethan needed every dollar saved for their own wedding. I interrupted quickly, offering to cover every cost. The drive, the hotel meals, even a private car if that would make it easier. I was almost pleading by the time I said it, but she cut me off mid-sentence. Her voice was final, clipped as if my generosity were an insult. "No, Claire, we cannot come. It is not possible. You have to understand." The line went quiet except for her breathing. I sat at the edge of my bed staring at the chipped paint on the wall, the phone pressed tight against my ear, feeling the sting rise in my throat. I opened my mouth again, but she had already ended the call. Moments later, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Rachel. "Sorry, sis, money is tight. Hope it's beautiful." A small heart emoji glowed at the end, careless and hollow. I stared at it for a long time, my thumb hovering above the screen, unable to type a single word back. I wanted to scream, to ask how money could suddenly be a wall too high to climb for the most important day of my life. But what came instead was silence. That night, Jordan found me sitting at the kitchen table with the lights dimmed low. He put a hand on my shoulder and bent down to kiss my cheek. "They are still your family," he whispered. "Maybe something will change." I leaned into his chest, not answering because the ache inside me knew nothing would. The next day, I spoke with Lily while we arranged centerpieces. She shook her head, her eyes flashing with the kind of outrage I was too tired to express. "Who misses their own daughter's wedding?" she muttered, tying ribbons with sharp tugs. I shrugged, pretending not to care, though my voice cracked when I told her I would still keep the 3 seats reserved at the front. She stopped what she was doing and looked at me. "You think they'll come after all?" I pressed my lips together and said nothing. Deep down, I clung to the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they would change their minds. As the week went on, deliveries arrived, fittings were finalized, vows practiced in quiet moments before bed. Yet each night I checked my phone, waiting for some sign from them. Nothing came. Only Rachel's text sat there, staring back at me like a mocking smile. I remembered when we were kids, when Rachel and I used to dress up in old white curtains and parade around the backyard pretending it was our wedding day. She had always insisted on being the bride and I the maid of honor, trailing behind her in my 2 big shoes. I wondered if she remembered that too, if any part of her cared that the roles were now real and she had chosen to stay away. The morning before the wedding, I drove to the church to drop off decorations. The pews stood waiting in silence, the ribbons for the reserved seats already tied in neat bows. I stood in front of them, fingertips brushing over the polished wood. My chest tightened at the thought that they might remain empty, that I might walk down that aisle and see nothing but vacant space where my family should be. Still, I asked the coordinator to make sure those 3 seats were kept untouched. She gave me a puzzled look but nodded. That night, I lay awake listening to the faint hum of traffic outside my window. Jordan slept beside me, his hand resting across my waist, steady and protective. My eyes traced the ceiling and I whispered a prayer I was not even sure I believed in. Please let them come, please let me be wrong. I closed my eyes, clutching the thin line of hope tighter than I should have, unaware of the storm waiting just ahead. Sleep had always been restless for me before big moments, and that night it was no different. The bed in my small apartment in Providence felt too wide and too empty, and the silence was filled with ghosts of old memories I never asked for but could never quite silence. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the radiator, and somewhere in that stillness, my mind began pulling me back through time, stitching together all the moments when the seats meant for me had been left unoccupied. I thought first about college graduation, the day that should have felt like a crowning moment after years of exhaustion and sacrifice. I walked across the stage in a cap and gown I had rented with money saved from my part-time job at the library. The stadium was alive with cheers, parents and siblings, waving signs, camera flashes like starlight in the afternoon sun. I smiled for the photos, but when I scanned the crowd, my own row sat still. The folding chairs marked with our last name were untouched, the programs stacked neatly where no hands had picked them up. Hours later I learned that Rachel had her regional dance competition that very same weekend. I told myself it was fine that she was younger, that maybe her moment mattered more. But when the applause died down and I walked out alone clutching my diploma, the sting stayed with me. That sting only grew sharper in the years after. When I landed my first real job at a marketing firm in Boston, I wanted so badly to make them proud. I invited them to the celebration dinner for my promotion. I saved up to buy a navy dress from Macy's, picked out a decent bottle of wine even though it stretched my budget, and reserved 3 extra seats at the long table in a little Italian restaurant in the North End. As the evening went on, my coworkers filled the room with laughter, clinking glasses, and teasing me about my new title. I kept glancing at the door, waiting for the familiar faces I had pictured so clearly in my head. They never arrived. When dessert was served, I ordered an extra slice of tiramisu and packed it carefully into a container. I carried it home thinking maybe someone would be there waiting. But when I unlocked my apartment door, the silence met me like an old friend. I sat down on the kitchen floor, still in that navy dress, the container of cake in my lap, and let myself feel the truth. Dad had chosen bowling night. Mom had been busy setting up for a friend's birthday, and Rachel had sent me a text filled with exclamation marks that somehow felt emptier than the space beside me. The only person who had ever shown up for me without fail was my grandfather Robert. He was steady in a way that no one else had been, a man whose palms were calloused from years of carpentry but whose touch was always gentle when it rested on my shoulder. One summer afternoon, after yet another ceremony I had faced alone, he found me sitting on the back porch staring at the yard. He lowered himself into the chair beside me, the wood creaking under his weight, and said words I carried with me long after he was gone. "You deserve to be loved, Claire. Never forget that." I remember the way my throat closed up, how I could only nod quickly and look away, but inside I carved those words into stone. They became the proof I needed even when everyone else seemed determined to show me otherwise. Tonight, lying in the dim light of my apartment, those words echoed back. I got up and crossed the room to the old wooden box I kept on the shelf. It was chipped along the edges, the hinges squeaked, but inside it held every scrap of memory I had decided mattered. I pulled out a stack of DVDs and slipped one into the player, my fingers trembling as the screen flickered to life. The footage was shaky, filmed by an uncle on an old camcorder, but the images were sharp enough to make my chest tighten. It was Rachel's high school graduation. The camera zoomed across the crowded field until it found my parents in the bleachers. The lens caught the exact moment Rachel's name was called. There was Mom, hands clasped tightly, her face wet with tears as her youngest walked across the stage. Dad stood and clapped with unfiltered pride, his voice ringing above the others. I pressed pause, freezing their expressions on the screen. My throat burned. I had walked across my own stage years before, holding the same kind of diploma, the same kind of accomplishment. But I had looked out into an empty row, hearing only the applause of strangers. And here was proof that the love and pride they were capable of giving had simply never been meant for me. I sank into the couch staring at the still image. The tears came hot and fast this time, but they were not just grief. They were clarity slicing through the illusions I had spent years weaving to protect myself. I had always told myself they cared just in ways I could not always see. That they loved me quietly from afar. But watching my mother's tears for Rachel while my own milestones had gone unacknowledged, I knew the truth. Love had been rationed and the scales had never tilted in my favor. I reached for my phone, thumb hovering over my contacts where Grandpa's number still sat, though he had passed 2 years ago. I wanted so badly to hear his voice again, to feel that certainty he had given me. Instead, I set the phone down and opened the closet. Hanging there was his old flannel shirt, faded blue with a faint scent of sawdust that time had not yet stolen. I buried my face against it and let myself cry until the fabric grew damp. When I finally stepped back, the room felt impossibly still. The glow from the television flickered, casting my mother's frozen face across the walls. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and whispered into the silence. "I wish you could see me, Grandpa. I wish someone did." The clock on the stove ticked past midnight, the second hand clicking like footsteps in an empty hallway. I switched off the screen and curled beneath the blanket on the couch. The old disappointments pressed in around me, heavy but familiar. Somewhere ahead was a wedding day I had built with my own hands, a new life I was ready to begin. And somewhere inside, even beneath all the ache, I clung to the hope that maybe this time the seats I saved would not be left empty. The night before my wedding stretched out long and restless, the silence in my apartment pressing against my ears until I could hardly stand it. I sat at the edge of my bed staring at my phone, its black screen glowing faintly with my reflection. My chest tightened with every second that passed. I knew what I was about to do. I had promised myself I would, not that I had to stop asking for scraps of love, but desperation is a strange companion. It pushes you to try one more time even when you know better. I pressed the number saved under Mom and held the phone to my ear. It rang once, twice, 3 times, and I almost hung up before I heard her voice. "Hello," she said flatly, as if she had been expecting a telemarketer. "Mom, it is me," I whispered, already fighting back tears. "Please, just listen to me." There was a pause, then the sound of her sigh carried through the line. "Claire, it is almost midnight. What is going on?" "Tomorrow is my wedding day," I said, the words breaking on my tongue. "I want you there. I need you there. Please, I will cover everything. Gas, hotel, food, even if Dad needs a doctor for his back, I will handle it. Just come." I heard the clatter of something in the background, maybe dishes being put away. Her tone was sharp when she answered. "Stop being so dramatic. We already talked about this." Tears slipped down my cheeks. "It is not drama, Mom. It is my wedding. I saved those seats for you, for Dad, for Rachel. I do not care about the excuses, I just want you there. I will pay, I will make it easy." Her voice grew colder, each word clipped like ice. "Claire, life does not revolve around you. We have responsibilities. Rachel and Ethan are saving for their future, and your father and I cannot just drop everything because you want a perfect picture. We will celebrate after." The line cut through me like a knife. After. Always after, never when it mattered. I pressed my palm against my forehead, my breath shaking. "You do not understand. It will not be the same without you." "Enough," she snapped, as if she were scolding a child. "Tomorrow will be fine. You have people there who care about you. Do not guilt us into something we cannot do." Her words silenced me. I held the phone tight, waiting for her to soften, waiting for even the faintest sign she cared. None came. Finally, I whispered, "Okay." The line went dead with a click that echoed louder than it should have. I sat there in the dark, the phone slipping from my hand onto the sheets. My whole body trembled with a mix of anger and grief. I had begged, I had offered, I had laid myself bare, and still it was not enough. It had never been enough. I stumbled out of the bedroom and into the living room, wiping my face with the back of my hand. The old disappointments circled like vultures, pecking at what little hope remained. I stared at the bookshelf where the small wooden box from my grandfather rested. For years I had left it unopened, too afraid of what it might stir up inside me. He had given it to me the summer before he passed, his weathered hand pressing it into mine as he said words I did not understand at the time. "When the moment comes, this will help you." I pulled the box down and sat on the floor, my legs folded beneath me. My fingers traced the grain of the wood, the hinges squeaking faintly when I lifted the lid. Inside lay small tokens of his life and his love for me. A faded Polaroid of us fishing at the lake when I was 8, his smile wide beneath his cap. A folded napkin with his messy handwriting, a note that simply read, "Proud of you always." And at the very bottom, an envelope with my name written carefully in his hand. I held it for a long moment, unable to open it, my tears blurring the letters. I pressed it against my chest, hearing his voice as clearly as if he were beside me again. "You deserve to be loved, Claire. Never forget that." The clock on the wall ticked louder in the silence, each second reminding me that morning was coming, whether I was ready or not. I placed the envelope back into the box and closed the lid, my hands shaking but steadier than before. I sat there until the first light of dawn began to seep through the curtains, the room shifting from shadows to pale gold. My wedding day had arrived. I would walk into it without the family I had begged for, but with the strength of the man who had never once let me down. The morning air in Newport carried the scent of salt from the harbor and roses from the courtyard where the florist had been working since dawn. My dress hung on the door, a quiet sentinel waiting for me to step into it. By the time the makeup artist finished, the hotel suite buzzed with soft chatter and the sound of my bridesmaids adjusting their gowns. My heart pounded, not from nerves about marrying Jordan, but from the echo of the empty seats I already knew would be waiting. When the moment came to walk down the aisle, Uncle Tom extended his arm with a gentle smile. He was Jordan's uncle, a man with kind eyes who had stepped up without hesitation when he heard my parents would not be there. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The words caught in my throat, and I managed only a quiet thank you before I slipped my hand into the crook of his arm. The doors opened and the music swelled. Guests rose to their feet, faces glowing in the warm light streaming through the tall windows of the chapel. My eyes found Jordan at the end of the aisle. His expression was a mixture of awe and tenderness that made the room fall away. Every step I took toward him seemed to stitch back a part of me that had been torn open the night before. When I reached him, his hand wrapped around mine with a steadiness that calmed the tremor in my body. "You are everything," he whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. Tears pressed at my lashes, but for the first time in days they were not born of grief. The ceremony unfolded in a blur of vows and trembling voices. Each promise I spoke carried weight, not just for Jordan but for myself, a declaration that I could build something new, something whole. When the pastor pronounced us husband and wife, the room erupted in applause, and Jordan pulled me into a kiss that left me breathless. At the reception, the hall was lit with strings of golden lights that shimmered against the glasses raised in toasts. Laughter spilled from every table. Patricia, Jordan's mother, slipped into the chair beside me and leaned close, her hand covering mine. "You are the daughter I always wanted," she whispered, her eyes wet. The warmth of her words cut through me with a strange kind of sweetness and ache. I managed a smile, holding back the sob that threatened to escape. Jordan's family filled the gaps my own had left. His cousins pulled me onto the dance floor, his aunts wrapped me in hugs, his father raised his glass with pride. For a few fleeting hours, I let myself sink into their embrace, into the rhythm of joy that carried us all. But whispers began to ripple through the crowd like a draft sneaking in under the door. At first I thought it was nothing, just the natural buzz of guests sharing stories. Then I noticed the sideways glances the phones held a little higher, the murmurs that paused when I drew near. My stomach tightened. One of the bridesmaids, her face pale, approached and slid her phone discreetly onto the table in front of me. Her eyes held an apology. I looked down. There on the screen was a photo posted less than an hour ago. My sister Rachel, her fiancé Ethan, and my parents all dressed in evening wear, champagne glasses raised against the backdrop of a vast ocean. The caption read, "Formal night on the Queen Mary 2. So blessed." The air drained from my lungs. My fork clattered against the plate, and for a moment the sounds of the reception blurred into nothing but a distant hum. The picture was undeniable. While I had been promising forever in front of 100 witnesses, they had been smiling for cameras on the deck of a luxury cruise liner. Heat rushed up my neck, my skin prickling. I could feel eyes on me, guests waiting to see my reaction, wondering if I knew. I pushed back my chair slowly, forcing myself to move calmly, though inside my chest felt like it might burst. I stepped out of the hall, my heels clicking against the marble, the walls closing in tighter with every step. Outside, the cool night air hit me like a slap. I wrapped my arms around myself, staring out at the water beyond the hotel gardens. The lights of the harbor shimmered in the distant, ships rocking gently against the tide. Somewhere out there, the Queen Mary 2 was cutting across the Atlantic with my family aboard, celebrating while I tried to steady my breath on my own wedding night. For a long moment, I stood frozen, the laughter and music from the reception muffled behind me, my veil fluttering in the sea breeze. The image on that phone replayed in my mind again and again until it carved itself into me. And all I could think was how perfectly it captured the truth I had refused to see. Jordan found me outside and without a word draped his jacket over my shoulders. His hand rested on the small of my back, steady, urging me to breathe. We stood together until I felt my legs could hold me again. When we finally returned upstairs to the hotel suite, I expected silence, maybe the kind of exhaustion that follows a storm. Instead, my phone buzzed across the nightstand the moment I set it down. It was a message from Deborah, a longtime friend of my mother's who had known me since I was a child. She rarely contacted me directly, which made the late hour all the more startling. The text was short but sharp enough to cut through me. "Claire, I think you should know. Your dad has been pulling money from Robert's account. That cruise wasn't paid for by them. It was Robert's savings." I read the words 3 times, hoping I had misunderstood, but the meaning only grew clearer. My grandfather's account. The one he had set aside for medical expenses, household needs, and small comforts in his later years. I had helped him set it up, and I knew exactly how carefully he had managed every dollar. My stomach flipped. I shoved the phone toward Jordan, my voice shaking. "Look at this. Tell me I'm reading it wrong." Jordan frowned, scrolling through the message before meeting my eyes. He didn't try to soften it. "We need to check," he said. "Right now." My hands trembled as I opened my laptop and logged into the account. The numbers glared back at me like a wound. Where there had once been a balance of over $52,000, there was now less than $3,000. My throat went dry. I clicked through the transaction history, each line hammering against my chest. 11,000 for Cunard Line, noted clearly for 4 tickets on the Queen Mary 2. Another withdrawal for a hotel in Southampton. And then tucked in between a payment labeled deposit for event hall reservation identical to the one Rachel had bragged about for her upcoming wedding reception. My fingers hovered above the keyboard, useless and shaking. All of it was there in black and white. They hadn't just abandoned me. They had stolen from the man who had been the only one to stand beside me all my life, using his savings to fund their celebration while I walked down an aisle alone. I covered my mouth with my hand as the sob finally broke free. My body curled forward, the laptop nearly sliding from my knees. Jordan caught it, setting it aside, then pulled me into his chest. His arms wrapped around me so tightly it felt like he was holding me together when I might otherwise splinter apart. "They took everything from him," I gasped. "That was his money, his security. They didn't even ask." Jordan stroked my hair, his voice calm but firm. "We're not going to let them get away with this. First thing Monday, we'll call a lawyer. We'll pull every statement, every record. Your grandfather trusted you with this account, and we'll honor that." I shook my head, tears running hot across my cheeks. "It isn't just the money, it's what it means." They looked me in the eye and said they couldn't afford to be here. They told me taxes and gas and excuses, all while spending my grandfather's savings on champagne toasts at sea. Jordan pressed his forehead to mine. "Let them toast. Let them think they've won. This isn't over." The weight of his words steadied me, though the pain still clawed deep. I pulled away just enough to look at the glowing laptop screen again. The list of transactions blurred through my tears, but the truth was undeniable. The timeline lined up perfectly. My family had been planning their absence long before they ever offered excuses. I closed the laptop with a snap that echoed in the quiet room. My veil still clung to my hair, heavy with the scent of roses from the ceremony, but it felt like a costume I no longer deserved to wear. I pulled it free and laid it across the chair. My reflection in the mirror showed smeared mascara and swollen eyes, a bride undone on the very night meant to mark her new beginning. Jordan brushed his thumb across my cheek, wiping a streak of black. "You're not undone," he said softly. "You're stronger than any of them even now." I wanted to believe him. But all I could think of was my grandfather's voice, steady and kind, saying the words that had carried me through so many lonely years. "You deserve to be loved." Tonight those words echoed louder than ever, a reminder of what had been stolen, not just from him but from me. I sank into the edge of the bed, my body trembling with the weight of betrayal layered upon betrayal. Jordan knelt in front of me, his hands holding mine. "We will fight this," he promised. And I believed him because he had never once broken a promise to me. The clock ticked past 2 in the morning, the city outside settling into silence. My dress pulled around me, the silk heavy and wrinkled. Jordan helped me out of it, gently folding it across the chair with care. We climbed beneath the sheets, not as newlyweds lost in bliss, but as two people bound together in the quiet determination to face what waited ahead. As the room darkened, my tears finally slowed. The numbers from the account still burned behind my eyelids, each digit a betrayal carved into memory. But Jordan's arms stayed firm around me, anchoring me to something real, something honest. I let my eyes close, not to sleep, but to hold on to the vow I had made silently to myself. This was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning of a reckoning they would never see coming. The morning after the wedding carried a silence that felt heavier than the exhaustion in my bones. Jordan and I sat at the small table in our suite, untouched plates of breakfast between us. He held my hand across the table, his thumb brushing circles on my skin, grounding me. Before noon struck, we were sitting in the polished office of Thomas Harrison, a man my grandfather had once trusted with everything. Thomas looked older than I remembered, his gray hair trimmed, close glasses perched low as he sifted through a folder thick with documents. He greeted me with the kind of warmth that made me ache because it reminded me of the only man who had ever stood solidly behind me. "Claire, your grandfather spoke about you constantly. He was proud of you." I swallowed hard, my voice rough. "He never told me he left me anything." Thomas folded his hands together, his gaze steady. "That was by design. He wanted to protect you until the right time. The truth is, your grandfather left you his entire estate, not just the small account you managed for him. Everything." The word hung between us like a stone dropped in water. Everything. I leaned forward, my breath catching. "What do you mean, everything?" Thomas pulled out a packet of papers, sliding them gently across the desk. 3 rental properties in Providence and Warwick, fully paid off. Combined market value just over $350,000. A modest investment account worth around $70,000. His savings, personal effects, and... He reached for a smaller envelope, placing it carefully in front of me. "His letters to you. He wanted you to have these only once you were ready to hear the full truth." My fingers shook as I touched the envelope, but I didn't open it yet. I was still stuck on his first words. 3 houses, a fund, all of it mine. Jordan's voice cut through the fog. "But the account is nearly empty. The cruise. The reception." Thomas nodded grimly. "Yes. Your parents have been intercepting communication from me for years. They forged your signature on several documents to delay the transfer of assets. In the meantime, they have collected rental income from the 3 properties, approximately $4,500 a month. They led me to believe you were aware, but it is clear now that you are not." My breath whooshed out of me as if I had been punched. My parents had been living off my inheritance while looking me in the eye and telling me they had nothing left. They watched me scrape through years of rent in shabby apartments while pocketing what was rightfully mine. Thomas leaned back, his tone softened but resolute. "Your grandfather wanted you to have security, independence, and the freedom to choose happiness. He told me often that you were the light of his life. And he feared they would try to dim that light if given the chance." I finally tore the envelope open, the paper inside worn and faintly yellow. My grandfather's handwriting sprawled across the first page, strong even in his later years. My dearest Claire, if you are reading this, then it means you have reached the moment when you are no longer a child in their shadow. You deserve to be free to build a life that no one can take from you. Do not let them convince you that your worth depends on their approval. You are stronger than you know. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. I wiped them quickly, clutching the letter close. Each line felt like he was sitting beside me again, whispering truths I had spent years too afraid to believe. There were more letters in the bundle dated across different years. Some spoke of memories we shared, others offered encouragement for the future he would not live to see. But one line on a folded sheet struck me like lightning. Do not let them steal your light, fight if you must. Jordan squeezed my hand, his voice steady. This changes everything. I nodded slowly, the weight of betrayal shifting into something sharper. Anger clean and focused. For years I had begged for scraps of affection while they lived off what was mine. And, all along, the man they discarded had seen me as the one worthy of trust. Thomas slid another document forward, his pen poised. We will need to begin proceedings immediately to recover control of the properties and accounts. It may take months, but the law is on your side. For the first time in days, maybe years, I felt a flicker of power return to me. They had lied, stolen, and humiliated me, but they had not destroyed me. My grandfather had ensured that. I tucked the letters back into the envelope, holding them against my chest. My voice was quiet but firm when I finally spoke. I will not let them take another thing from me. Jordan looked at me with pride, and Thomas gave a small nod as if he had been waiting for those words. The room felt brighter, not because the sun had shifted, but because something inside me had. I was no longer the daughter or sister left behind. I was the rightful heir of a legacy they had tried to erase. And for the first time, I believed I could fight. 2 mornings later, I woke to the buzzing of my phone vibrating across the nightstand. At first, I thought it was just wedding messages I had ignored, but when I finally picked it up, dozens of notifications crowded the screen. Marcus, Rachel's ex, had posted a video. His face filled the frame, his voice tight with the kind of hurt only betrayal leaves behind. He told the world how Rachel had laughed about skipping my wedding for a cruise, how my parents had called me desperate and pathetic behind my back, how I had always been the one sacrificed for her spotlight. By the time I finished watching, the view count was already past 700,000. By evening, it crossed 1 million. The comments scrolled faster than I could read, strangers piecing together a story I had lived in silence for years. Jordan leaned over my shoulder, his jaw tight. This is blowing up, Claire. Look at these headlines. He turned the laptop toward me. Local outlets had already picked up the story. A bold caption screamed across the top of one site. Family skips daughter's Newport wedding to sail luxury, Queen Mary 2. Underneath, a photograph of my empty aisle seats was paired with screenshots of Rachel and Ethan clinking champagne glasses on deck. I pressed my palms against my face, the heat of humiliation creeping into my skin. My life had become spectacle. The phone rang again, this time a cousin from Connecticut. Claire, what is going on? Everyone in the family group chat is fighting. Aunt Linda says Rachel should be ashamed. Uncle Paul says you're exaggerating. I closed my eyes, listening to the swirl of voices around me even when I hung up. Some defended Rachel, saying she had always been the golden child and deserved to enjoy life. Others were horrified, admitting they had seen things over the years but never spoken up. It felt like my family had split down invisible lines that had always been there but were only now exposed to the light. That night, the storm worsened. Rachel went live on Instagram, her face perfectly made up, Ethan sitting stiffly behind her. She said she was heartbroken that her sister would twist the truth on her happiest week, that jealousy made people cruel, that she would pray for me to find peace. She ended the stream with a tear sliding down her cheek, perfectly timed. Jordan slammed the laptop shut. She is weaponizing this. I sat still, too drained to even argue. The flood of sympathy her followers poured in was immediate, thousands of comments telling her to stay strong, that her sister was clearly unstable. I wanted to scream, but instead I opened my grandfather's letters again. His handwriting steadied me, each word a reminder that truth does not need polish to stand. The next morning, the internet turned. Someone had pulled public probate records, documents anyone could request if they knew where to look. They posted screenshots of my grandfather's will. Clear as daylight, it named me the sole heir. Rachel's portion was a single line near the end. To my granddaughter Rachel, I leave my old set of golf clubs stored in the garage. It spread like wildfire. Commenters circled it in red, posted side by side with Rachel's live stream. Memes followed, some cruel, some sharp with justice. One showed Rachel on the cruise deck holding a golf club instead of champagne. Another wrote over her tearful face, "Play 9 holes, not my sister." For the first time since my wedding, I laughed. It was a small laugh, brittle but real. Jordan caught my eye and squeezed my shoulder. The truth is louder than her performance. But beneath the laughter there was a deeper ache. Because none of this noise would change the empty seats on my wedding day or the years of silence and dismissal. The storm outside was loud, but the storm inside was the one I had to survive. Still, as the sun went down and my phone buzzed with another wave of headlines, I felt a shift. For once I was not invisible. My story, however, messy, was no longer mine alone to carry. And that, at least for now, was enough to keep me standing. The first call came before breakfast, my phone vibrating across the counter as I poured coffee into a chipped mug. I didn't answer. By the time I sat down, 5 more had come in, then a stream of texts, each one angrier than the last. From my mother, "You have gone too far." From Rachel, "You are humiliating us for attention." From my father, "Pick up the phone or I'm coming over." I slid the phone face down and tried to focus on the warmth of the mug in my hands, the smell of coffee rising like something steady. But the buzzing kept breaking through, until finally I silenced it altogether. That afternoon, a thick envelope arrived in the mail, my name written in my father's heavy block letters. Jordan sat next to me at the kitchen table as I slid it open. Inside was a handwritten letter, shaky and uneven. "If you continue this, you will destroy your grandfather's legacy. He worked his whole life for that money, for those houses, and now you are dragging his name through mud. Stop this before it's too late." My hand trembled as I folded the paper back. Jordan read it over my shoulder and shook his head. "This isn't about your grandfather's legacy, Claire. It's about them losing control." He was right. My grandfather's words in those letters had been about love, resilience, and fighting for what was right. The only people staining his name were the ones who had stolen what was his to give. That night, I blocked their numbers one by one until the silence in my phone felt like air returning to my lungs. Jordan and I drove to Thomas Harrison's office the next morning, walking through the glass doors with a resolve I had never felt before. Thomas spread the paperwork across his desk, his voice calm but firm. "We will file both a civil case for restitution of assets and a criminal complaint for fraud and forgery. They may fight, but the evidence is on your side." I signed my name on line after line, my pen moving with a steadiness that surprised me. When the last page was done, Thomas gathered them together, slid them into a folder, and said quietly, "Now the law will speak." For a few days there was quiet. Too much quiet. I let myself believe maybe they had retreated, maybe they were reckoning with the truth. But the storm broke again on a Friday night. I was folding laundry when a loud pounding shook the apartment door. Jordan looked up from the couch, his face hardening. "Claire, stay back." Through the peephole, I saw my father swaying in the hallway, his eyes bloodshot, a bottle clutched in his free hand. His voice bellowed through the wood. "You think you can ruin us? You think the law will protect you? Open this door, Claire. Open it now." My chest tightened as he rattled the handle, then shoved hard enough to make the frame groan. Jordan grabbed the phone and dialed 911, his voice low and measured as he gave our address. My father kicked the door, then slammed his shoulder into it, shouting words that blurred into rage. The sirens came fast, the red and blue lights flashing across our living room walls before I could even catch my breath. 2 officers wrestled him back, his shouts echoing down the hallway as they cuffed his wrists. He reeked of alcohol, his shirt half untucked, his face twisted with something unrecognizable. I stood frozen, clutching the back of a chair as the neighbors peered from cracked doors. One officer stepped inside, asking if I was all right, if I wanted to press charges for attempted break-in. My voice shook, but I nodded. Yes. When they led him away, the building fell quiet again, but it was a different quiet this time. Not the silence of being ignored, but the silence that follows when truth becomes undeniable. Later, sitting on the couch with Jordan's arm around me, I realized that what had just happened would not only strengthen the case Thomas was building, it would finally strip away the last illusion I had been holding on to. My father was not a man misled by my mother or manipulated by Rachel. He had chosen this. He had chosen against me. I pressed my forehead against Jordan's shoulder, the steady rise and fall of his breathing grounding me. Outside, the city hummed with its usual life, but inside our small apartment, a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. The evidence was no longer just papers and bank records. It was the memory of my father's fist slamming into my door, his voice thick with threats, and the sound of handcuffs clicking closed in the hallway. And as I sat in that quiet, I knew we were past the point of no return. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and paper, the kind of sterile air that made every sound echo sharper than it should. I walked in with Jordan's hand brushing mine, studying me without words. Thomas carried the files, thick binders of evidence that had felt like lifelines in the weeks leading up to this. We took our seats at the long wooden table the judge already settled behind the bench. Across the aisle sat my parents and Rachel. My mother's hair was pinned too tightly, her mouth drawn into a thin line. My father looked tired, his skin gray from sleepless nights. Rachel dabbed at her eyes even before anything began, and Ethan sat beside her, stiff and silent, his gaze locked on the table. The judge called the case. The sound of his voice cut through the room, calm but unyielding. Thomas stood, his tone measured as he laid out the framework. Misappropriation of funds, forgery of legal documents, illegal obstruction of inheritance. He opened the first binder, sliding photographs, bank records, and signed deeds onto the evidence stand. I kept my eyes on the papers, not the faces across from me. Each page was a wound I had carried in silence for years, and now every cut was displayed under the fluorescent lights. When Thomas placed the forged signatures in front of the judge, my breath caught. My name, twisted into clumsy imitations, sprawled across contracts I had never seen. The judge raised his brows, turning the pages slowly before setting them aside. My father shifted in his chair, clearing his throat, but when the judge asked if he had a response, he stammered only that he had acted under pressure. My mother leaned toward him, whispering frantically, but her words carried no weight against the stark clarity of black ink on white paper. Rachel was called to speak. She rose with tears slipping down her cheeks, her voice trembling as she told the court she had no part in the financial dealings, that she only wanted her wedding and her family intact. She glanced at me, eyes pleading, as if I might nod and release her from responsibility. I didn't move. Ethan never spoke. He folded his hands in front of him, jaw clenched, eyes fixed forward as though he could vanish into the air if he held still enough. When it was my turn, I stood and told the truth. Not with theatrics, not with anger, but with the weight of years pressing through every syllable. I spoke of birthdays, missed of graduations, ignored of savings that vanished, while my grandfather's words of love were kept from me. I described the night my father pounded at my door, the fear in my chest as I heard him rage, and the shame of knowing it was not the first time he had chosen violence over honesty. The courtroom was silent when I sat down again. Even the sound of pages turning seemed to hesitate. Thomas closed his argument with finality. The evidence shows that my client is the rightful heir under her grandfather's will, and that the defendants knowingly and deliberately obstructed her inheritance for their own gain. We ask the court to recognize her legal standing and to freeze all assets until they can be transferred lawfully to her. The judge leaned back, hands steepled, his gaze sweeping the room. For a moment the air hung heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Then his gavel struck once, sharp and absolute. The court recognizes Claire Bennett as the lawful heir to the estate of Robert Bennett. All disputed assets are to be immediately frozen and prepared for transfer. Further proceedings regarding damages and criminal liability will follow. My mother let out a broken sound, half sob, half gasp, and collapsed against my father's arm. He sagged beneath her weight, staring at the floor as though the words had cracked something inside him. Rachel's face twisted, her tears giving way to fury. She snapped at the judge, insisting it was unfair that I had manipulated everything that she deserved what I had been given. The bailiff's warning silenced her, but her glare burned into me as if she could undo the ruling by sheer force of will. I sat very still, my pulse roaring in my ears, but beneath the noise was something I had never felt before. Certainty. The truth had been spoken in a place where their voices could not drown mine out. As the courtroom emptied, Jordan's hand found mine again, warm and steady. Thomas packed the binders with quiet efficiency, his small smile betraying nothing but calm satisfaction. I walked out into the crisp afternoon light, the courthouse steps beneath my feet solid in a way the ground had never felt before. For the first time in my life, I did not carry the weight of their denial. I carried the strength of justice standing behind me. The wind brushed against my face, cool and sharp, and I let it fill my lungs before exhaling slowly. Somewhere behind me, voices echoed in anger and despair, but ahead the path was open. And though I knew the fight was not yet over, I also knew they could no longer erase me. News spread faster than I could process it. Within a week of the judgment, my parents received notice from the bank. The house they had lived in for 30 years, the one with the blue shutters and the hydrangeas my mother pruned every spring, was no longer theirs. They had leveraged it too many times, spent too recklessly, and now, without the safety net of my grandfather's estate, foreclosure was inevitable. Neighbors whispered as movers carried out furniture, and my father's head bent lower each time another box scraped across the driveway. Rachel and Ethan fared no better. The headlines about forged signatures and stolen inheritance still floated online, each comment section a bonfire they couldn't extinguish. The glossy wedding that Rachel had bragged about for months collapsed overnight. Vendors canceled contracts, and the venue refused to refund deposits. Ethan's company released a terse statement distancing itself from him, citing a clause about reputational harm. By Monday morning, he was unemployed, his work badge disabled, his inbox locked. I didn't seek any of this. But karma, it seemed, had its own rhythm, and all I had to do was step aside and let it roll downhill. Extended family who once clung to Rachel's charm began drifting away. My Aunt Sharon, who had always praised Rachel's ambition, called me in tears after reading the court transcripts. She apologized for years of silence. My uncle from Ohio sent a letter admitting he had believed the worst about me because it was easier than questioning the family story. None of it healed the wounds, but each message was a small confirmation that truth once spoken aloud could not be swallowed back. 2 weeks after the trial, I opened the Bennett house for a gathering. The dining table, polished to a shine, was set with simple food, nothing extravagant. People arrived hesitantly, cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, a few old neighbors, even my grandfather's longtime friend Mr. Alden, who shuffled in with his cane. I welcomed them not because I needed their approval, but because I wanted to draw a line. When the room grew quiet, I stood at the head of the table. My hands didn't shake. Family, I said, is not only about blood, it is about who stands by you when the lights are harsh and the stories are ugly. My parents and Rachel chose to erase me, but each of you here chose to stay. That is what family means to me now. There was a stillness after I finished, and then Mia, my younger cousin with a bright laugh, came forward and hugged me. She had been the only one to call me during the worst days, leaving little messages that said simply, "I believe you." I knew then that she was the only relative I wanted to keep close. Later that evening, I handed out envelopes. Inside each was a cease and desist prepared by Thomas. It wasn't dramatic, just necessary. No one in my immediate family was to contact me again, not through calls, letters, or back channels. I didn't owe them explanations, and I wouldn't allow new manipulations to slip into my life. The recipients accepted the papers in silence. Some nodded in understanding, others shifted uncomfortably, but no one objected. When the last guest left, the house felt both emptier and lighter. I walked through the rooms, touching the banister my grandfather had built, the window frames he had painted himself. So much history lived in those walls, but not all of it was mine to carry forward. On a rainy Thursday morning, I signed the final paperwork to sell the old Bennett house. The realtor slid the contracts across the desk, her pen clicking softly. I paused for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in. That house had held my childhood, my disappointments, the shadows of every overlooked milestone. Now it would belong to someone else. I signed my name in bold strokes. As I set the pen down, a strange calm washed over me. I wasn't abandoning my past, but I was refusing to let it define me any longer. The old stories, the empty chairs, the ache of waiting for people who never came, those belonged to another life. Outside, the rain had eased into a mist. I stepped onto the sidewalk, breathing in the damp air. My grandfather's words echoed quietly in my mind. Do not let them take your light. Fight. And for the first time, I felt like I already had. 2 years can fold quietly into a life you hardly recognize as your own. In Boston, the seasons turned and turned again, and our little apartment became a home filled with the soft chaos of toys and laundry and the smell of coffee in the mornings. Jordan kept his promise to build something whole with me. On a late spring afternoon, our daughter arrived, small and fierce, a warm weight pressed against my heart. We named her Grace after the grandmother who had loved me from a distance and left behind a small fund that became our first safety net. When I said her name, the word felt like a blessing spoken into the air. Sleep came in broken pieces during those first months, and in the quiet hours I would walk the hallway with Grace tucked against my shoulder, listening to the city breathe through the open window. Some nights I would hum the same tune my grandfather used to whistle when he sanded wood in his garage. I could almost see him, sleeves rolled, eyes crinkled with a grin, nodding as if to say that I was doing just fine. On the worst nights, I would reach for his letters and read a few lines until the knot in my chest loosened. He had written about courage and kindness, about choosing joy without asking permission. He had written about light. By the time the leaves turned in our second autumn, the legal dust had settled. The properties were transferred, the accounts repaired, the last document signed and filed away. We sold the rentals and set up a college fund for Grace and another small fund for a future we had not yet imagined. I kept one thing from my grandfather's house, a hand-carved step stool with dents and scratches from 3 decades of use. Grace learned to pull herself up on it, palms flat, knees wobbly, the first sign that she would chase whatever called to her. Mia came to visit on a gray Saturday, taller and brighter than I remembered, with a canvas tote stuffed with books for the baby. She told me she was applying to nursing school and felt ready to leave the old stories behind. We sat at the kitchen table while Grace gnawed on a teething ring and Jordan stirred soup on the stove. Mia asked if it ever stopped hurting. I told her the truth. It changes shape. Some days it is a shadow that slips in and out of rooms. Other days it is only a memory tucked between happier ones. It never vanishes, but it stops steering the ship. We heard little from my parents or from Rachel, and that little arrived through attorneys rather than phones or doorbells. The cease and desist orders did their quiet work. There were no ambushes, no midnight knocking, no sudden pleas dressed up as apologies. Once I saw a photo someone else had posted of Rachel working a new job at a front desk in a suburban office park. I felt no triumph, only a distant wish that she might one day find a version of herself not built on someone else's silence. I did not type a word. I closed the app and took Grace to the park. On winter evenings, Jordan and I would push the stroller down Commonwealth Avenue, our breath clouding the air as lights glowed in brownstone windows. We had little rituals that made ordinary days feel sacred. Friday night, pasta; Saturday morning, pancakes; Sunday, walks along the river. Sometimes we would stop on the footbridge and I would point out the boats to Grace, small white triangles sliding across the water, and I would feel the ache of the past tug once, then loosen its grip. The life I had wanted was no longer a promise held above my head. It was the ground beneath my feet. One quiet afternoon, I took the last envelope from my grandfather's box and held it for a long time before opening it. The paper was thinner than the others, as if time had pressed it smooth. His handwriting flowed strong and familiar. He wrote of the girl he had known and the woman he believed she would become. He wrote that happiness is not a prize given by people who once withheld it, but a path you choose and walk every day. He wrote that joy lived openly is its own kind of justice. At the end, he told me to be so happy that those who had dimmed my light would feel the absence of it the way you feel a door close on a winter night. I read that last line again and again until the words settled into me like a promise kept. When Grace took her first steps, she wobbled from Jordan's hands to mine, a little comet of determination with curls bouncing and eyes wide. We cheered so loud the upstairs neighbor laughed through the ceiling. I scooped her up and held her against my chest, the same spot where once there had been a hollow. It was full now. I could feel Jordan's arms wrap around us both, and the three of us stood there laughing in the kitchen with flour on the counter and a pot simmering on the stove. Later, after she fell asleep, I sat on the floor beside her crib and thanked the quiet for teaching me to listen for the sound of my own heart. Spring returned soft and green. On a Sunday drive back from visiting a friend in Rhode Island, we took a detour through the old neighborhood. Jordan did not ask if I was sure. He simply reached over and laced his fingers with mine. The Bennett house appeared at the end of the street like a memory made real. Someone had painted the shutters a cheerful sage and planted tulips along the walkway. A little boy on a red scooter cut wide circles in the driveway, while a golden retriever trotted behind him. Through the front window, I saw a woman set a vase of wildflowers on the sill and a man carry in a box with a child's drawing taped to the side. I parked across the street and turned off the engine. For a moment, I just watched. The old ache rose and then faded like a tide. That house no longer held the sound of cutting remarks or the slap of a slammed door. It hummed with bedtime stories and muddy shoes and someone humming in the kitchen while water boiled for tea. It was exactly what a house should be. I smiled without meaning, to the kind of smile that starts in your chest and moves all the way to your eyes. Jordan squeezed my hand. "You okay?" he asked, though he knew the answer. I nodded. "Better than okay." He kissed my knuckles and we drove on, the past staying where it belonged, the present opening in front of us like a sunlit road. That night, after Grace fell asleep, we sat on the balcony with blankets around our shoulders and mugs warming our palms. The city glowed. I took out the last letter once more and read the final paragraph aloud, not as a plea but as a benediction. I was no longer asking for anyone else to write my ending. I was living it. When I finished, Jordan leaned his head against mine. We sat there for a long time without speaking, listening to the faint sounds of late-night laughter rising from the street, the far-off wail of a siren, the soft rhythm of our daughter's breathing through the open window. Peace is not a loud arrival. It comes like this, quiet and complete, and you realize you have been walking toward it for years. Before I went inside, I looked up at the sliver of moon and thought of my grandfather. I pictured him at his workbench, a lamp casting a pool of light over curled shavings of wood, and I felt again the simple certainty he had given me. Some people spend their lives chasing applause that always fades. Others build rooms where love is not a test. I chose the second, and it has changed everything. If your family had to choose between showing up for your wedding or taking a luxury vacation, would you want to know the truth? Tell me what you think in the comments. Tap like if this story stayed with you, and subscribe to hear more voices and more endings that find their way to the light.